On a bright summer morning, the Thompson family packed their SUV with excitement, ready for their long-awaited beach vacation. Mr. Thompson, a seasoned FBI agent with 15 years of service, carefully checked their route one last time while his wife loaded the cooler with snacks for their two children, aged 8 and 12. The family had planned this trip for months, a chance to escape the demanding nature of Mr. Thompson's work and spend quality time together. Mrs. Thompson, an elementary school teacher, had specifically chosen this week when both she and the children would be on break. Their destination was a beautiful coastal town, promising 5 days of sun, sand, and precious family memories. As they drove through the first few hours of their journey, the mood in the car was light-hearted. The kids played their travel games in the back seat, occasionally breaking into fits of laughter. Mrs. Thompson hummed along to the radio while her husband navigated the highway with practiced ease. Everything seemed perfect until they crossed the state line. The first sign of trouble came when Mr. Thompson noticed a patrol car following them closely. Being in law enforcement himself, he maintained his speed exactly at the limit and kept his driving pristine. Yet, the patrol car's presence lingered, staying behind them for an unusually long time. "Honey," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, glancing in the side mirror, "they've been following us for almost 20 minutes now." Mr. Thompson nodded, keeping his voice calm for the children's sake. "I know. Just stay relaxed." As an FBI agent, he'd learned to read situations like this, and something didn't feel right about this particular follow. The patrol car's lights suddenly flashed to life, its siren wailing briefly to signal them to pull over. Mr. Thompson carefully guided their SUV to the shoulder of the road, his hands positioned at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The children fell silent in the back seat, their game forgotten. "It's okay, kids," Mrs. Thompson turned to reassure them, though her own heart was racing. "Daddy's just going to talk to the officer for a minute." As Mr. Thompson waited, he watched in his mirror as two officers approached their vehicle, one on each side. His training kicked in, and he began mentally documenting every detail of the situation. The officers' approach seemed unnecessarily cautious, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the first officer commanded, his tone sharp and authoritative. "License and registration." Mr. Thompson spoke clearly and calmly. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my credentials slowly. They're in my wallet in my back pocket." "Just the license and registration," the officer repeated, more forcefully this time. Mrs. Thompson could feel her children's anxiety growing. Their youngest had started to tremble slightly, while their older child watched the scene unfold with wide, confused eyes. "Officer, Mr. Thompson tried again, "I believe it's important for you to know that I'm a federal agent. I'm reaching for my FBI credentials along with my license." The officer's demeanor shifted slightly, but he maintained his aggressive stance. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Mr. Thompson complied, moving deliberately and announcing each action before he made it. As he stepped out, he could see his family's worried faces reflected in the car window. He'd faced dangerous situations before in his line of work, but having his family witness this treatment made his stomach churn. The second officer began questioning Mrs. Thompson through the passenger window, asking where they were headed and why they were traveling through the area. Their children sat perfectly still, their vacation excitement completely evaporated. As Mr. Thompson stood by the patrol car, he maintained his professional composure while the officer ran his credentials. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours to the family waiting anxiously in the SUV. Other cars whizzed past, their occupants slowing briefly to stare at the scene. The atmosphere shifted dramatically when the officer returned from his patrol car, his entire demeanor transformed. The FBI credentials had been verified, and suddenly the officer's tone became apologetic. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Agent Thompson," the officer said, though his explanation for the stop remained vague and unconvincing. "You're free to go. Have a nice vacation." Mr. Thompson returned to his vehicle, his hands slightly shaking with controlled emotion. As he settled back into the driver's seat, the patrol car pulled away, leaving the family in a heavy silence. "Are you okay, Daddy?" their youngest asked in a small voice. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, meeting his wife's concerned gaze. They both knew this moment would require careful navigation. It needed to be a teaching moment for their children, but not one that would instill fear or bitterness. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm okay," he replied, turning to give his children a reassuring smile. Sometimes things like this happen, and it's important to know how to handle them calmly and safely. As they pulled back onto the highway, Mrs. Thompson reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. They had experienced similar situations before, but this was the first time their children had witnessed it directly. The incident would undoubtedly lead to some difficult but necessary family discussions. The remainder of that day's drive was quieter than its beginning, with both parents carefully answering their children's questions about what had happened. They worked to balance honesty with hope, explaining the realities of their experiences while emphasizing the importance of maintaining dignity in working toward positive change. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the Thompson family crossed into their destination state. The beach was now just a few hours away, promising the relaxation and joy they'd been looking forward to. Despite the earlier incident, they were determined not to let it overshadow their precious family time together. This experience would become a significant moment in their family's story, not just of their vacation, but of their larger journey through life's challenges and triumphs together. As they drove on toward their destination, the Thompson family's bond grew stronger, their understanding deeper, and their determination to face whatever came their way as a united front more resolute than ever. The Thompson family arrived at their beachfront hotel just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. Despite their exhaustion from the long drive and the earlier incident, the children's excitement returned as they caught their first glimpse of the ocean waves glinting under the hotel's exterior lights. As Mr. Thompson checked in at the front desk, Mrs. Thompson noticed him discreetly showing his FBI credentials to the hotel manager. It was a habit he'd developed over the years, not to receive special treatment, but to ensure there was a record of law enforcement presence in case of any further incidents. The events of the day had left them both more cautious than usual. Their hotel suite was spacious and welcoming, with a balcony overlooking the beach. While the children explored every corner of their new temporary home, Mr. Thompson stepped out onto the balcony alone, needing a moment to process the day's events. The sound of crashing waves below helped calm his racing thoughts. Mrs. Thompson joined him after getting the kids settled. "The children want to know if we can go to the beach tonight," she said softly, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He turned to face her, his expression troubled. "I saw how scared they were today," he said quietly. "Our oldest, did you notice how she watched everything? She understood what was happening." "I know," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady but sad. "But she also saw how you handled it. You showed them strength and dignity today. That's a lesson they'll never forget." Inside the suite, they could hear their children's excited chatter as they unpacked their beach toys. The pure innocence of their enthusiasm created a stark contrast to the tension of the afternoon's events. "Let's take them to the beach," Mr. Thompson decided, managing a genuine smile. They deserve to end this day with joy. The family changed into their swimwear, grabbed some towels, and made their way down to the beach. The night air was warm and humid, and the beach was relatively empty except for a few other families taking evening walks along the shore. Their youngest ran ahead, chasing the waves as they rolled in and out, while their older child walked between her parents, occasionally glancing up at them as if checking that they were truly okay. Mr. Thompson noticed this and gently pulled her close for a side hug as they walked. "You know," he began, using this quiet moment for a heart-to-heart conversation, "what happened today wasn't right. But it's important to remember that there are good people in every profession, including law enforcement. My colleagues at the FBI, they're people who work hard to protect everyone equally." Their daughter nodded thoughtfully. "Like you, Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart. And that's why days like today, though difficult, remind me why my work is so important. Every person deserves to feel safe and respected." As they walked along the shore, they encountered another family, a couple with 3 children who were also collecting seashells in the moonlight. The parents exchanged friendly waves, and soon the children were comparing their shell findings, their laughter mixing with the sound of the waves. Mrs. Thompson watched as their youngest showed off a particularly large shell to their new friends, her heart warming at how quickly children could form connections, unburdened by the complexities that adults carried. This was what they had come here for, these simple, joyful moments. Later that night, after showers and a late-night snack of delivery pizza, the family gathered on the suite's balcony. The ocean breeze carried the salt spray up to them, and the moon cast a silver path across the water. It was peaceful, yet the day's events still lingered in their minds. "Should we file a report?" Mrs. Thompson asked quietly after the children had gone to bed. She knew her husband had been considering it since the incident. Mr. Thompson sighed, running his hand over his face. "Part of me wants to." The stop was clearly inappropriate, and as an FBI agent, I have a responsibility to address misconduct when I see it. He paused, looking out at the moonlit ocean. "But I also know filing a report means extending this incident, possibly having to cut our vacation short for interviews and paperwork." His wife reached for his hand. "Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But remember why we came here, to spend time together, to make memories with our children. Maybe the best response right now is to focus on that." Mr. Thompson squeezed her hand, grateful for her wisdom. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rhythm of the waves and their children's soft breathing from inside the suite. Before heading to bed, Mr. Thompson made a few calls to his colleagues at the FBI field office nearest to where the incident had occurred. He didn't file an official complaint, but he made sure the incident was noted informally. Sometimes, he knew, tracking patterns was more effective than individual reports. As they prepared for bed, they could hear their youngest mumbling in their sleep, probably dreaming of seashells and sandcastles. Their older child had placed her collected shells on the bedside table, arranged in a perfect line, each one chosen with care during their nighttime beach walk. Mr. Thompson looked at his sleeping children, then at his wife, who was already drifting off to sleep. Despite the day's challenges, they were here, together, safe. Tomorrow would be a new day, a day for building sandcastles, splashing in the waves, and creating the kind of memories that would far outlast the sting of today's incident. As he finally lay down to sleep, Mr. Thompson made a silent promise to himself and his family. While he couldn't shield them from every unfair encounter they might face, he could help them build the strength, dignity, and resilience to face whatever challenges came their way. More importantly, he could help them find joy and love even in the face of adversity. The sound of waves continued their steady rhythm outside, nature's lullaby slowly washing away the tension of the day, preparing them all for the adventures that tomorrow would bring. The next morning arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through the hotel suite's windows. The Thompson family woke to the sound of seagulls and distant waves, the previous day's tension giving way to vacation excitement. Their youngest bounced from bed to bed, already in their swimsuit, while their older child helped Mrs. Thompson prepare breakfast on the suite's small kitchenette. Mr. Thompson stood at the coffee maker, watching his family's morning routine with a warm smile. He'd received several text messages from his FBI colleagues overnight, expressing concern and support after hearing about the incident. One message, from his direct supervisor, particularly stood out: "Take care of your family first. We'll handle the rest." As they enjoyed their breakfast on the balcony, watching early morning beachgoers set up their umbrellas below, they planned their day. "I want to build the biggest sandcastle ever," their youngest declared, mouth full of cereal. "After we apply sunscreen," Mrs. Thompson reminded them, already reaching for the beach bag she'd packed with all the essentials. Years of family trips had made her an expert at vacation preparedness. The beach was already bustling when they made their way down. Families of all backgrounds were setting up their spots for the day, children running back and forth from the water's edge, and the sound of laughter mixing with the crash of waves. The Thompsons found a perfect spot to set up their beach umbrella and chairs. As Mr. Thompson secured the umbrella in the sand, he noticed a few police officers walking the beach on their regular patrol. His body tensed instinctively, but he forced himself to relax, remembering his promise to focus on family time. Their children were already busy with their sand buckets and shovels, starting the foundation of their ambitious sandcastle. Mrs. Thompson joined them, showing them how to mix the perfect amount of water with the sand to make it stick together better. "Dad, we need your engineering expertise," their older child called out, gesturing to their growing structure. Mr. Thompson laughed, remembering how his FBI training in architectural analysis was now being put to use for sandcastle construction. As the morning progressed, their castle attracted attention from nearby beachgoers. A group of children asked if they could help, and soon the Thompson children were directing their new friends in adding towers and moats to their expanding creation. Mrs. Thompson watched from her beach chair, taking photos and videos of the collaboration. She noticed how their older child had taken charge of the project, confidently giving instructions and making sure everyone felt included. Despite yesterday's events, their children's natural ability to connect with others remained unchanged. Around midday, one of the beach patrol officers approached their area. Mr. Thompson felt his wife's hand grip his arm, but the officer simply smiled and commented on the impressive sandcastle. "Mind if I take a picture for our community bulletin board?" he asked, gesturing to the elaborate structure the children had built. The Thompson children beamed with pride as the officer snapped a photo, and Mr. Thompson felt a complex mix of emotions. This positive interaction didn't erase yesterday's experience, but it reminded him that change was possible, one small moment at a time. As the sun climbed higher, the family took a break for lunch at a nearby beach cafe. Over sandwiches and cold drinks, they chatted with a local family at the next table who recommended their favorite spots for shell collecting. "The best shells wash up just before sunset," the local mother shared, drawing a small map on a napkin. "If you go to the rocky point past the lighthouse, you'll find the really special ones." Their youngest was particularly excited about this inside information, already planning their evening shell hunting expedition. Their older child, however, seemed distracted, watching a news report playing silently on the cafe's TV about a recent incident involving law enforcement. Mr. Thompson noticed their attention and used the moment for another gentle conversation. "You know," he said quietly, "being afraid or angry about unfair treatment is natural. But it's what we do with those feelings that matters." "Is that why you didn't get angry yesterday, Dad?" their older child asked, showing once again their perceptiveness. "I felt angry inside," he admitted, "but I chose to respond with dignity and professionalism. Sometimes that's the most powerful response we can give." Mrs. Thompson added, "And look at today, we're here, enjoying our vacation, meeting new friends, building amazing sandcastles. That's another kind of power, the power to keep living joyfully despite challenges." After lunch, they returned to their spot on the beach. The afternoon brought new activities, swimming in the warm ocean waters, collecting unique shells, and adding more elaborate details to their sandcastle. Their youngest discovered a small hermit crab, leading to an impromptu marine biology lesson from a passing beach naturalist. As the day progressed, Mr. Thompson found himself gradually unwinding. Watching his children splash in the waves, hearing their laughter, and feeling the warm sun on his skin, he was reminded of what really mattered. His role as an FBI agent was important, but his role as a father was paramount. Late afternoon brought a surprise when their sandcastle won the beach's informal daily competition, earning them free ice cream from the beachfront vendor. As they enjoyed their treats, watching the sun begin its descent, Mrs. Thompson captured a family selfie, all of them with ice cream-stained smiles, sandy feet, and genuine happiness in their eyes. "This is going in the family album," she declared, showing them the photo. "Look at those happy faces." Their youngest piped up, "Can we come back tomorrow and build an even bigger castle?" "Of course we can," Mr. Thompson replied, ruffling their hair. "But first, I believe we have a sunset shell hunting expedition to prepare for." As they packed up their beach gear, preparing for their evening adventure to the rocky point, the Thompsons felt the day's simple pleasures had helped heal something from yesterday. They hadn't forgotten the incident, but they had chosen not to let it overshadow their time together. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors as they walked along the shore, their shadows stretching long behind them. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but for now, they were content in this moment, together as a family, strong and united. The rocky point near the lighthouse proved to be everything the local family had promised. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Thompson family made their way along the shoreline, their footprints trailing behind them in the wet sand. Their youngest skipped ahead, plastic bucket swinging, while their older child walked thoughtfully beside their parents, occasionally stooping to examine interesting finds. The lighthouse keeper, an elderly man with weathered skin and kind eyes, noticed them approaching and waved from his post. "You folks picked the perfect time for shell hunting," he called out. "The tide's just starting to turn." As they drew closer, the lighthouse keeper introduced himself as Mr. Rivers, a retired Coast Guard officer who'd been tending the lighthouse for the past decade. Something about his gentle demeanor put Mr. Thompson at ease, a rare feeling since yesterday's incident. "I've been watching shells wash up here for 10 years, Mr. Rivers shared, joining them on their hunt. "Every shell has its own story, just like every person who visits this beach." He glanced knowingly at Mr. Thompson, and somehow, Mr. Thompson sensed that this man understood more than he was saying. Their youngest was delighted when Mr. Rivers showed them a hidden tide pool among the rocks, teeming with tiny sea life. "Look, Mom," they exclaimed, pointing at a small starfish clinging to the rocky surface. Mrs. Thompson carefully helped them take photos, making sure they didn't disturb the creature's natural habitat. As the children explored the tide pools under Mrs. Thompson's watchful eye, Mr. Rivers turned to Mr. Thompson. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent 30 years in the Coast Guard. Saw all kinds of situations, good and bad. But what always struck me was how the ocean treats everyone the same, doesn't matter who you are or what you look like." Mr. Thompson nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the lighthouse keeper's words. "Sometimes I wonder if we're making any progress," he confided, watching his children examine their discoveries. "Progress isn't always visible day to day," Mr. Rivers replied, his eyes on the setting sun. "It's like the tide, you might not see it moving, but look away long enough, and everything's different when you look back." Their conversation was interrupted by excited shouts from the children, who had discovered a large conch shell partially buried in the sand. Their older child carefully dug it out, handling it like a precious treasure. Mr. Rivers examined their find with genuine appreciation. "Now that's special," he said, showing them how to listen to the ocean sound within the shell. "In all my years here, I've only seen a handful this perfect." The discovery led to Mr. Rivers sharing stories about the history of the lighthouse and the surrounding area. He told them about shipwrecks and rescues, about storms weathered and lives saved. The children listened intently, especially when he described how the lighthouse had once guided a lost fishing boat to safety during a terrible storm. As twilight approached, Mr. Rivers invited the family to join him for a special treat, a sunset view from the top of the lighthouse. "Not many get to see this," he said with a wink, "but I have a feeling your family will appreciate it." The climb up the spiral staircase was exciting for the children, who counted each step aloud. When they reached the top, the view took their breath away. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, painted in brilliant oranges and pinks by the setting sun. From this height, they could see their hotel, their sandcastle still standing proudly on the beach, and the entire coastline stretching in both directions. Mr. Thompson felt a strange peace settle over him as he watched the sun sink toward the horizon. "You see that?" Mr. Rivers pointed to where the sky met the sea. "Every sunset is different, but they're all beautiful in their own way. Reminds me that even the hardest days end with something beautiful if we're willing to look for it." Mrs. Thompson squeezed her husband's hand, both of them understanding the wisdom in the lighthouse keeper's words. Their children, pressed against the railing, were too absorbed in the spectacular view to notice the tears in their mother's eyes. As darkness began to fall, Mr. Rivers showed them how the lighthouse mechanism worked, explaining how the powerful beam helped guide ships safely through the night. The children were fascinated by the technical details, asking questions that made the old lighthouse keeper smile. "You know," he said to their older child, "it takes all kinds of light to guide people home, lighthouse beams, stars, even the moon. But sometimes the most important light comes from people who stand up for what's right, who show others the way through dark times." Before they left, Mr. Rivers gave each child a special shell from his personal collection. "Sometimes the best treasures are the ones we share," he said, helping them wrap the delicate shells in soft cloth for safe keeping. The walk back to their hotel was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence filled with the sound of waves and the first evening stars appearing above. Their youngest clutched their shell wrapped in cloth, while their older child kept looking back at the lighthouse, now sending its powerful beam across the darkening waters. In their hotel room that evening, as the children carefully arranged their shell collection on the dresser, Mr. Thompson reflected on the day's encounters. The contrast between yesterday's tense police stop and today's warm conversation with Mr. Rivers couldn't have been starker. Later, after the children were asleep, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson stood on their balcony, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the darkness. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said softly, "meeting Mr. Rivers today, it felt like more than just chance." Mr. Thompson nodded, thinking about the old lighthouse keeper's words about progress and change. Sometimes, he realized, the most powerful messages come not from confrontation or formal complaints, but from quiet moments of understanding and shared humanity. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, a reminder that even in darkness, there are always guides and guardians helping light the way toward better days. The Thompsons went to bed that night feeling more hopeful than they had since the start of their vacation, their dreams filled with seashells, lighthouses, and the wisdom of an old keeper of the light. The third day of their vacation dawned with an unexpected summer storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the Thompson family watched rain drops race down their hotel window panes. Their youngest pressed their face against the glass, counting the seconds between lightning flashes and thunder, while their older child curled up on the couch with a book from the hotel's small library. Mr. Thompson checked his phone, noting several missed calls from his FBI office. He stepped onto the covered balcony to return them, the humid air clinging to his skin. The calls were about the incident from their first day. Word had spread through official channels, and his superiors wanted to address it formally. "We have dashcam footage," his supervisor informed him. The stop was clearly problematic. "We're prepared to file an official complaint if you want to pursue it." Inside, Mrs. Thompson was organizing an impromptu indoor picnic with supplies they'd bought from the local market yesterday. She watched her husband through the glass doors, recognizing his work posture, straight-backed, serious, professional. When he finally came back inside, she could read the conflict on his face. "The office wants to pursue it," he said quietly, helping her arrange sandwiches on paper plates. "They say it's important to document these incidents, even if we're not asking for specific action." Their older child looked up from their book, clearly listening though pretending not to. Mrs. Thompson noticed and decided it was better to address things openly. "What do you think, sweetheart?" she asked. "You were there too." Their child considered for a moment, marking their place in the book. "Maybe it could help other families not go through the same thing," they said thoughtfully. "Like Mr. Rivers said about the lighthouse, sometimes we need to help show the way." The wisdom in their child's words struck both parents. Even as the storm raged outside, they felt a sense of clarity settling over them. Mr. Thompson stepped out once more to call his office back, this time with a clear decision to move forward with the documentation process. As the morning progressed, the family made the best of their rainy day. They built a blanket fort in the living area of their suite, telling stories and playing card games. Their youngest proved surprisingly skilled at Go Fish, while their older child taught everyone a new card game they'd learned at school. Around midday, there was a knock at their door. To their surprise, it was Mr. Rivers, carrying a large box. "Thought you folks might like some rainy day entertainment," he said, setting the box down. Inside were old photographs and documents about the lighthouse's history, along with some vintage board games and puzzles. "The lighthouse has seen its share of storms," Mr. Rivers said, settling into an armchair at their invitation. "But it's the stormy days that make the calm ones more appreciated." The children were fascinated by the old photographs, especially ones showing the lighthouse during historic storms. Mr. Rivers shared stories about each picture, weaving tales of courage, perseverance, and community that had the whole family captivated. As they looked through the historical documents, they found records of the lighthouse's role in helping escaped slaves find freedom via the Underground Railroad. Mr. Rivers explained how the lighthouse's beam had served as more than just a navigation aid, it had been a symbol of hope and safety for those seeking freedom. "Sometimes," he said, looking meaningfully at Mr. Thompson, "standing up for what's right means being a light for others, even when it's difficult or dangerous." The afternoon passed quickly with Mr. Rivers. Stories and the vintage board games. The storm outside began to ease, though the rain continued steadily. Their youngest had fallen asleep in the blanket fort, while their older child was thoroughly engrossed in an old maritime puzzle. During a quiet moment, while the children were occupied, Mr. Rivers shared something personal with the parents. "I saw what happened your first day here," he admitted. "News travels fast in a small beach town. It's not the first time something like that has happened to visitors, and that's partly why I wanted to reach out." He explained how he and other community members had been working to address such incidents through education and community engagement programs. "Change happens slowly," he said, "but it does happen. Every documented incident, every peaceful response, every bridge built between people, it all adds up." Mrs. Thompson felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to the old lighthouse keeper. Here was someone who understood, who had seen similar situations play out over years, yet maintained his faith in progress and human goodness. As evening approached and the storm finally began to clear, Mr. Rivers prepared to leave. Before going, he invited the family to join him the next day for a special sunset lighthouse tour, this time including areas usually closed to the public. After he left, the family ordered room service for dinner, creating a picnic on their blanket fort floor. As they ate, they discussed the day's conversations and discoveries. Their older child was particularly moved by the lighthouse's Underground Railroad history. "It's kind of like your job, Dad," they observed. "The FBI helps protect people too, right?" Mr. Thompson nodded, touched by the comparison. "That's right. And sometimes protecting people means standing up and saying when something isn't right, even when it's uncomfortable." As night fell, the lighthouse beam became visible through their windows, cutting through the lingering mist from the storm. The family stood together at the window, watching its steady rotation. Something about the day's experiences, the storm, Mr. Rivers' stories, the history they'd learned, had helped them see their own situation in a new light. Their youngest, still sleepy from their nap, pointed at the lighthouse beam. "It's like a big flashlight showing the way home," they said simply. Mrs. Thompson hugged her family close, thinking about lighthouses and guidance, about storms and calm seas, about the courage to stand up for what's right and the wisdom to do it with dignity. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but for now, they were content watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the night sky, steady and sure, a reminder that even after the stormiest days, light always finds a way to shine through. The next morning brought crystal clear skies, the air freshly cleaned by yesterday's storm. The Thompsons' hotel room was still scattered with Mr. Rivers' historical documents and games, which they'd promised to return during their special lighthouse tour later that day. While the children helped pack up the borrowed items, Mr. Thompson received another call from his FBI office. The formal documentation of the traffic stop incident was proceeding, and several senior officials had expressed their concern and support. More importantly, they discovered a pattern of similar stops in the area, making their report even more significant. "Your experience might help create real change," his supervisor explained. "Sometimes it takes someone with your credentials to make people listen." Mrs. Thompson was organizing their beach gear for the afternoon when she overheard part of the conversation. She noticed their older child lingering nearby, clearly interested in what was happening. These past few days had opened up many opportunities for important family discussions, and this seemed like another one. After the call, the family headed down to the beach for the morning. The storm had left the sand scattered with shells and other treasures from the sea. Their youngest was delighted to find several sand dollars, perfectly preserved by the gentle waves. As they walked along the shore, they noticed their sandcastle from 2 days ago had partially survived the storm. While most others had been washed away, the strong foundation they built had kept part of their structure standing. "Look at that," Mrs. Thompson pointed out. "Sometimes when you build something strong enough, it can weather any storm." Their older child seemed to understand the metaphor. "Like our family?" they asked, helping their younger sibling repair one of the castle's walls. "Exactly like our family," Mr. Thompson agreed, beginning to help with the restoration efforts. Soon, other beachgoers joined them, and the castle repair became a community project. A retired architect offered suggestions for strengthening the structure, while a group of children gathered shells to decorate the walls. The morning turned into an unexpected lesson in community building and resilience. Around noon, they spotted Mr. Rivers walking along the beach, collecting debris left by the storm. He waved when he saw them and came over to admire their restored sandcastle. "Now that's what I call rebuilding better," he said, noting how the new design was actually stronger than the original. "Sometimes what gets rebuilt after a storm is more impressive than what stood before." The children proudly showed him their modifications, especially the new moat system they designed to help protect against future waves. Mr. Rivers listened intently, offering gentle suggestions and praise for their engineering skills. Before heading back to the lighthouse, Mr. Rivers shared some exciting news. "I've been thinking about our conversations," he told Mr. Thompson. "I've contacted some friends in the Coastal Community Alliance. We're organizing a forum to discuss improving relations between law enforcement and visitors to our beach towns." The initiative sparked hope in Mr. Thompson. It was encouraging to see how their challenging experience was already catalyzing positive change in the community. Later that afternoon, the family made their way to the lighthouse for their special tour. Mr. Rivers met them at the base, carrying a ring of ancient-looking keys. "Today," he said with a twinkle in his eye, "you're going to see parts of this lighthouse that tourists never get to visit." He led them through hidden doorways and up secret staircases, sharing stories about the lighthouse's role in local history. In one particularly memorable moment, he showed them the original lighthouse logbooks, dating back over a century. Every keeper wrote in these books, he explained, carefully turning the delicate pages. Every storm, every rescue, every challenge they faced. It's a record of not just the lighthouse, but of human perseverance. Their older child was particularly moved by an entry from 1892, describing how the lighthouse keeper had helped a family in distress despite facing personal danger. The parallel to their father's FBI work and their current situation wasn't lost on anyone. The highlight of the tour came when Mr. Rivers led them to a small room just below the main light chamber. The walls were covered with photographs, decades of lighthouse keepers, rescued sailors, and community events. "This is our memory room," he explained. Every picture tells a story of times when this lighthouse and its keepers made a difference in someone's life. To the family's surprise, Mr. Rivers pulled out a camera. "I'd like to add your family's picture to this wall," he said. "Your story, how you're handling this situation, how you're turning it into something positive, it deserves to be remembered." The Thompsons posed together, the setting sun casting warm light through the window. As Mr. Rivers took the photo, they felt the weight of the moment. Their family was becoming part of this lighthouse's long history of guidance, protection, and positive change. After the photo, Mr. Rivers shared one final surprise. He presented each family member with a small, handcrafted lighthouse pendant. "These are made from sea glass found on our shores," he explained. "A reminder that even things that seem broken can be transformed into something beautiful." As the day drew to a close, they all climbed to the top of the lighthouse to watch the sunset. The view was even more spectacular than before, the storm-cleared air providing perfect visibility for miles in every direction. Standing there, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, Mr. Thompson felt a deep sense of peace. The incident that had started their vacation still mattered, and they would continue to address it through official channels. But somehow, through the wisdom of an old lighthouse keeper and the strength of their family bond, they'd found a way to turn a negative experience into something meaningful and positive. Their youngest pointed excitedly as Mr. Rivers began the process of lighting the lighthouse beam for the evening. The massive lens slowly came to life, beginning its nightly rotation, sending out its message of guidance and hope to all who might need it. As they watched the first sweep of the beam across the darkening water, the Thompson family stood together, their new pendants catching the light. They were part of something bigger now, part of this lighthouse's story, and part of the ongoing journey toward positive change in their world. The second-to-last day of their vacation began with a special breakfast invitation from Mr. Rivers. He had asked the family to join him at a small local cafe near the lighthouse, known for its homemade blueberry muffins and spectacular ocean views. When they arrived, they found not just Mr. Rivers but several other community members gathered around a large table. There was the retired architect who had helped with their sandcastle, the local family who had shared shell hunting tips, and a few other familiar faces from their beach encounters. "Hope you don't mind the company," Mr. Rivers said, pulling out chairs for the children. "When I mentioned you were leaving tomorrow, folks wanted to say goodbye properly." The cafe owner, a warm-hearted woman with silver hair, brought out a tray of freshly baked muffins. "On the house," she insisted, setting down extra butter and homemade jam. "We heard about what happened your first day here, and we wanted you to know that's not who we are as a community." As they enjoyed breakfast, Mr. Thompson noticed a local newspaper on a nearby table. There was a small article about the community forum Mr. Rivers had organized, scheduled for the following month. The topic: Building Bridges, Creating a Welcoming Coastal Community. Their older child spotted the article too and asked if they could keep a copy. "I want to remember that something good came from what happened," they explained, carefully folding the paper. The conversation over breakfast flowed naturally, touching on everything from local history to future plans. The retired architect shared stories about designing coastal homes to withstand hurricanes, which fascinated the children. The local family's kids talked about their favorite secret beach spots, drawing maps on napkins for the Thompson children to take home. "You know," the cafe owner said as she refilled coffee cups, "sometimes it takes an unfortunate incident to wake people up, to make them realize changes are needed. Your family's dignity in handling that situation, well, it's inspired quite a few conversations in town." Mr. Rivers nodded in agreement. Change happens one conversation at a time, one action at a time. Like waves shaping the shoreline, you might not see it happening, but over time, everything transforms. After breakfast, the community members had another surprise. They'd organized a special beach day for the family's last full day of vacation. The retired architect had brought professional-grade sand sculpting tools. The local family had packed a picnic lunch to share. Even the cafe owner contributed a cooler of homemade lemonade. Together, they all headed to the beach. The children immediately began planning their most ambitious sandcastle yet, this time with proper engineering guidance from the architect. Adults set up umbrellas and chairs, creating a comfortable space for everyone. As they worked on their creation, more people joined their group. A marine biologist doing research in the area stopped to teach the children about the local ecosystem. A professional photographer offered to take family photos with their sandcastle. Mr. Thompson watched it all with a full heart. His FBI training had taught him to be observant, to notice details, and what he saw today was community in action, people coming together to right a wrong, to show that one incident didn't define their town. Mrs. Thompson sat beside him, squeezing his hand. "Look at our children," she said softly. Their youngest was learning sand sculpting techniques from the architect, while their older child was deep in conversation with Mr. Rivers about the upcoming community forum. "They're learning such important lessons," Mr. Thompson replied. "Not just about handling difficulty, but about how good people can come together to make things right." Around midday, someone spotted dolphins playing in the waves. Everyone rushed to the water's edge to watch, the children squealing with delight as the graceful creatures leaped and played. It was a magical moment that seemed to symbolize the joy that had emerged from their challenging start. The afternoon brought more surprises. The local family's children had organized a beach scavenger hunt, complete with handmade maps and clues. Teams were formed, mixing the Thompson children with their new friends, and soon everyone was engaged in the exciting search. Mr. Rivers sat with Mr. and Mrs. Thompson under an umbrella, watching the hunt unfold. "You know," he said, "I've been keeper of this lighthouse for many years, but I've learned more about its true purpose this week than ever before." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson asked. "A lighthouse doesn't just warn of danger," he explained. "It shows people they're not alone out there. It reminds them that someone cares enough to light the way. That's what this community is trying to do now, light the way towards something better." As the sun began its descent, the group gathered for a farewell bonfire, properly permitted and set up safely away from their magnificent sandcastle. The cafe owner had brought supplies for s'mores, and soon everyone was roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The children played tag in the dimming light, their laughter carrying across the beach. The adults talked about the upcoming community forum and other plans to make their town more welcoming. Mr. Thompson shared some insights from his FBI experience about building trust between law enforcement and communities. As darkness fell, Mr. Rivers pointed out the lighthouse beam beginning its nightly journey. "Tomorrow you'll head home," he said to the Thompsons, "but you're leaving something important behind, hope for change, and a reminder that every family deserves to feel welcome here." The bonfire slowly died down to glowing embers, matching the stars appearing overhead. The Thompson children, tired but happy, sat with their parents, sticky from s'mores and satisfied from a day well spent. Their oldest spoke quietly, "Dad, remember when you said sometimes the best response is dignity? I think I understand now. It's not just about how we handle bad things, but about giving people a chance to show their good side too." Mr. Thompson hugged his child close, amazed at their wisdom. Looking around at the group of people who had chosen to spend their day making his family feel welcomed and valued, he felt profound gratitude. Sometimes, he realized, the worst moments could lead to the best examples of human kindness. As they walked back to their hotel that night, the lighthouse beam sweeping over them periodically, the Thompsons felt they had experienced something truly special. Their vacation had transformed from a troubled beginning into a powerful lesson about community, resilience, and the capacity for positive change. On their final morning, the Thompson family woke up early to watch the sunrise from their hotel balcony. Their suitcases stood packed by the door, but they weren't quite ready to leave. This place, despite their difficult start, had become special to them in unexpected ways. Mrs. Thompson served breakfast on the balcony, their last meal with this magnificent ocean view. Their youngest arranged their lighthouse pendant and shell collection on the table, wanting to enjoy these treasures one last time before carefully packing them away. "Can we come back next year?" their youngest asked, munching on toast and watching seabirds glide past. "I want to build another sandcastle with everyone." Their older child was quieter, writing in a journal they'd started keeping after their first lighthouse visit. They'd been documenting everything: the incident, Mr. Rivers' stories, the community's kindness, and their own thoughts about it all. Mr. Thompson checked his phone one last time. The official report about the traffic stop had been filed, and his supervisor had messaged to say it was already prompting important discussions at higher levels. Sometimes, he reflected, positive change started with one well-documented incident. As they finished packing, there was a knock at their door. It was Mr. Rivers, accompanied by several community members they'd met during their stay. Each person carried something: the cafe owner with a basket of muffins for their journey, the local family with handmade friendship bracelets for the children, the retired architect with detailed sketches of their final sandcastle. "We couldn't let you leave without a proper goodbye," Mr. Rivers said, his eyes twinkling with emotion. He held a package wrapped in brown paper. "And we have something special for you." Inside the package was a framed photograph, the one taken in the lighthouse's memory room, but it had been combined with historical photos to create a beautiful collage. The images told a story: the lighthouse's past role in guiding people to safety, and its present role in bringing community together. "Look at the inscription," the cafe owner urged gently. On a small brass plate beneath the photos were engraved the words, "Every light in the darkness matters. Every stand for justice counts." The Thompson family, part of our lighthouse story, summer 2025. Mrs. Thompson felt tears welling up as she read the inscription. Their children crowded around to see, touching the frame with gentle fingers. Mr. Thompson stood quietly, deeply moved by this testament to how their difficult experience had transformed into something meaningful. "We're having it duplicated," Mr. Rivers explained. "One copy will stay in the lighthouse memory room. This one is for your family." The local family's children had drawn a card, signed by everyone who'd been part of their beach gathering yesterday. Inside were messages of friendship and hopes for future visits. Their youngest read each message aloud, beaming at the memories they represented. Before leaving the hotel, the Thompsons took one last walk on the beach. Their sandcastle still stood proudly, now surrounded by smaller ones built by inspired beachgoers. Mr. Rivers walked with them, sharing final bits of lighthouse wisdom. "You know," he said, stopping to pick up a perfect shell, "lighthouses were never just about warning ships away from danger. They were about guiding people home, showing them they weren't alone in the darkness. What your family did here, facing difficulty with dignity, helping inspire change, that's being a lighthouse too." Their older child, who'd been quiet all morning, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Rivers, could we help with the community forum? Maybe Dad could talk to them about his FBI work, about making things better?" Mr. Rivers smiled warmly. "We'd be honored. Change happens best when we all work together." As they prepared to leave, more community members gathered to wave goodbye. The cafe owner pressed more muffins into their hands. The retired architect promised to email his ideas for next year's sandcastle. The local family's children hugged their new friends, extracting promises to stay in touch. Mr. Thompson loaded the last bag into their SUV, this time feeling very different from when they'd first arrived. His wife caught his eye, understanding in her glance. Their vacation had become so much more than they'd expected: a lesson in resilience, a study in community, a story of how light can emerge from darkness. The children made one last trip to the beach wall, waving at the lighthouse. The morning sun made the white tower gleam, its beam now quiet until evening would come again. Their youngest called out, "Goodbye, Mr. Rivers. Goodbye, lighthouse." As they pulled away from the hotel, Mr. Thompson glanced in his rearview mirror. the group of community members was still there, waving. Mr. Rivers stood among them, his lighthouse keeper's jacket catching the morning breeze. The lighthouse towered behind them all, standing tall against the blue sky. They drove past the spot where they'd been stopped that first day. But now the memory, while still important, didn't carry the same sting. Instead, it had become the beginning of a story about positive change, about communities standing together, about light overcoming darkness. Their youngest fell asleep as they drove, clutching their lighthouse pendant. Their older child wrote in their journal, documenting their final moments in the beach town. Mrs. Thompson reached over and squeezed her husband's hand, both of them feeling grateful for how this vacation had transformed their family. Miles down the road, their older child looked up from their journal. "Dad," they said thoughtfully, "remember when you said your FBI work was about protecting people? I think this vacation showed us another way to protect people, by helping communities become better, by standing up for what's right, by being like the lighthouse." Mr. Thompson smiled at his child's wisdom in the rearview mirror. "You're absolutely right," he replied. "Sometimes the best protection isn't about force or power. Sometimes it's about lighting the way for others, showing them a better path forward." As their beach town disappeared behind them, the family carried with them more than just shells and photographs. They took with them lessons about courage and dignity, about the power of community to heal and transform, about how light can emerge from the darkest moments. And back in the beach town, their story had already become part of the lighthouse's legacy, a reminder that every family deserves respect, every incident of injustice deserves attention, and every small step toward positive change matters. The lighthouse beam would continue its nightly journey, not just guiding ships to safety, but now also standing as a symbol of hope and progress for all who visited their shores.